Hi, welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. I'm your host, Yaakov Katz. Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. Right now, countries across the Middle East are under active missile and drone attacks from Iran, and many of them are surviving because of American-made defense systems. There's Patriot batteries, there's THAAD interceptors, there's integrated radar networks, joint command centers. This isn't theoretical or abstract, it's the difference between a missile landing in a residential neighborhood or hitting a military base and being destroyed in the sky. But here's the problem. The interceptors are finite, they're expensive, they take time to produce, and in a sustained conflict, especially one involving Iran's missile arsenal, the question isn't just whether your systems work, it's whether you have enough of them. To unpack this critical issue, the race between offensive missile production and defensive interceptor capacity, I'm joined today by Bradley Bowman. Bradley serves as Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD, where he focuses on U.S. defense strategy and policy. He spent about a decade in the U.S. Senate as a national security advisor to members of the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee, and before that served for more than 15 years of active duty as a U.S. Army officer, actually as a Black Hawk pilot. He was also an assistant professor at West Point, teaching American politics, foreign policy, and grand strategy. Few people understand the intersection of Congress, the Pentagon, America's defense industrial base, and missile defense the way Bradley does. So we're going to talk about missile defense, why it's central to the survival of Israel and America's Gulf partners, why stockpiles of interceptors may be the most under-discussed strategic vulnerability right now, and what needs to happen to ensure that all of us can continue to be defended, but also can continue to fight. Because in modern warfare, victory is not just about who can launch more missiles, it's also about who can keep shooting them down. Stay with us. Bradley, it's great to have you with us here on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking out the time to talk to me. And you and I had the opportunity just a few days ago, though it seems like a lifetime ago, to share the stage at the AIPAC Congressional Summit, talking a lot about Iran, what's going to happen, what some of the challenges might look like. And back then, it was still the pre-attack days when no one really kind of knew what was going to happen. Seemed like diplomacy was still very much a key driver and a real possibility that a deal might be reached. So I just want to start with you, drawing on your experience and your look into how this played out. How surprised were you by the decision that the president ultimately took to launch the operation that's being called in the United States Epic Fury?
Well, it's great to join you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation and honored to be here. Thank you. When the protests really started to pick up in December and particularly in January, and President Trump came out and encouraged the protesters, essentially said, "I had your back," and threatened the regime to not hurt them. And then the regime proceeded to essentially shrug and then murder them by the thousands, some estimates more than 30,000. It seemed clear to me, as someone who's been doing this a while, both from a military strategic and working almost 9 years in the Senate and working in the Beltway, that President Trump was either going to have to get a big deal, a deal that he believed that he could sell with credibility to the American people as a big deal, what he called a meaningful deal, or that there would be military action. And my concern was at the time, and I was vocal publicly about this, including in a foreign policy podcast, that I worried that the shrewd Iranian negotiators would bamboozle, that's a technical term, bamboozle the American negotiators and convince them that a fundamentally bad deal was a good deal, and that Kushner and the president's son-in-law and Steve Witkoff would take that back to the president, and that America would once again agree to a very bad deal, bad for Americans, bad for our partners in the region, and good for the Islamic Republic of Iran. That was my fear. I knew a good deal, a meaningful deal, would include an end to Iran's nuclear program, zero enrichment, addressing their ballistic missile program, and an end to support for terrorism, and an end to the systematic murder of Iranians. You know, and I know that there's a snowball's chance in a very hot place that was ever going to happen. But I was worried again that the Americans would get bamboozled. Thankfully, that did not happen. They pressed for things like zero enrichment. They made generous offers. They repeatedly tried, as the president and others have highlighted. And so at that point, it was clear that military action was going to come, and the president lost patience. At that point, my question was, what would be the character of those military actions? How minimalist or maximalist would they be? We now know that this administration chose the more ambitious or aggressive end of military operations. And when you hear the president and then Secretary Hegseth this morning describe the objectives, oh my goodness, they're robust, right? It's basically the destruction of Iran's ballistic missile program, not degradation. These words have meaning in Pentagon land. Destruction of Iran's ballistic missile arsenal, their production capacity, their navy, their ability to project power outside their borders. Holy cow. And then, of course, the president in his first speech said that encouraged the Iranian people to rise up and take their government. And of course, we had the killing of the supreme leader, the only second death of a supreme leader we've seen in Iran since 1979. General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said this morning that that was an Israeli triggering event, an event triggered by Israeli military action that was informed by U.S. intelligence, which set off this huge American military operation where in the first 24 hours, the United States hit 1,000 targets. And so anyway, that's maybe more than you needed, but that's kind of how this came to unfold from my perspective.
So, I mean, the decapitation, I want to focus on that for a moment, because obviously this is very ambitious what they are trying to achieve. And I listened also to Hegseth and Kane and really talk about what is a massive military operation. This is not, and Pete Hegseth made this very clear, this isn't Midnight Hammer. This isn't, we're not just going after, it's not an isolated precision strike, one target, two targets, three maybe. This is big and very much focused on the western, southern flank of Iran, but they're hitting them hard, and there are days, if not weeks, still ahead. As you look at this, and you look at the target base, what I find to be interesting is that it's less nuclear, it's regime, it's missile, it's the military, Navy. I mean, can you talk to us a bit about what do you infer from the different the bank of targets, what they're choosing to go after, and what this tells us about the larger objective of the war?
Sure. Some of this is exactly what, I served in the U.S. military, as you know. I was a Black Hawk pilot and taught at West Point and so forth. And so I followed these sorts of things for a while. And some of this is exactly what you would expect. The thing I had been saying before this latest round was that this is not going to be like the 12-day war, and this is not going to be like Venezuela. So I was a little bit worried, and publicly so at times, that this administration was kind of hyped up on the incredible success of the extraordinary operation in Venezuela, and might think that Iran is Venezuela, which it clearly is not. But some of this is what you'd expect. And General Kane said this morning that the first movers here were Cyber Command, U.S. Cyber Command, and U.S. Space Command. And so cyber attacks and activities from space that set the table, if you will, for the kinetic operations, the aircraft airstrikes that followed. And then what followed? Well, exactly what you'd expect followed: a focus on radars, air and missile defense sites. It's like you have to take out the guard at the door before you can go in and do what you need to do inside the building. So that's exactly what you did. But I think your analysis is right. I don't have any reason to disagree with it. But just the breadth and depth of these strikes, once again, we see B-2s coming all the way from the United States, an extraordinary capability. The Israelis, they've declared that they have air superiority over Tehran. That's not surprising. We saw that during the 12-day war where, to use the metaphor I heard someone else use, the Israelis were basically playing soccer against an opponent without a goalie, meaning they could hit anything they want on the surface in Iran, a distinction I made at the time, unable, of course, to hit some of the hardened, deeply buried targets. That's why they needed the Americans and the B-2s right. in the last day. And here we are in the first 24, 48 hours, again coming in with the B-2s. So, two carrier strike groups, many destroyers, both basically almost every combat aircraft in the American arsenal, and much more. So ambitious, comprehensive, maximalist objectives that seem to depend in the final analysis to a significant degree on what the Iranian people are willing to do and able to do. And I'm very happy to talk about that if you like, because I have real concerns on that front.
There's been two criticisms that have been leveled at how this, at the basically the launching of this operation. Israel, there's always going to be criticism, but definitely in the United States. I'm not getting into the Democrats saying this is illegal, the president should have taken this to Congress. Put that aside for a moment. This wasn't an imminent threat. Why does America need to do this now? And number two is, we don't want a forever war. I mean, this is big, ambitious, as you've described it, Brad. Does this have the potential to become a forever war? So I'd like you, if you can, to tackle those two main points that we're hearing a lot of.
Yeah, so as someone who pays attention to details in this area, I listened to the president's initial speech very closely and went line by line, word by word, if I'm being blunt. And there was that word in the first few sentences: imminent. That's not an accidental word. That's probably not a word that President Trump would have put there on his own. That's there from the lawyers. And the reason that's there from the lawyers is if you're a student of the United States Constitution and debates, longstanding multi-decade debates about war powers, you understand that word imminent is an appeal to the president's Article 2, Section 2 authorities as commander-in-chief. Because there's the war powers are shared between the Article 1 branch, that's Congress. You can hear my bias there, 9 years U.S. Senate, and the Article 2 branch, the executive branch. And good old James Madison, he said, Father of the Constitution says Congress declares war. Of course, the last time the United States declared war was World War II. We've had a few wars since then, so we could talk about that. We need more time. But the use of that word imminent is the president's, and more directly his lawyers, saying, I'm doing this, the president, am doing this within the authority of my Article 2, Section 2. If one views imminent as days or weeks, I think that's clearly false. That's clearly false. I am as clear-sighted as anyone when you'll ever talk to you about the Islamic Republic of Iran and the threat it represents to American national security interests, setting Israel aside just from an American perspective. I have deep concerns about their determination to not relinquish their nuclear program, deep concerns about their ballistic missile program, deep concerns about the use of their space launch vehicle program as a means to build an intercontinental ballistic missile capability, deep, can I say, resentment about the use of terrorism and their murder of hundreds of Americans since 1979, and the list goes on and on and on. And I'm somewhat sympathetic to the argument that they were trying to create a conventional shield, to use Hegseth's phraseology, behind which they can move toward a nuclear weapon. I'm very sympathetic to all that. But I see no evidence, and there might be something in the classified domain that I'm not aware of, but they're certainly not sharing that with the American people. They'll say this is imminent. And so, we're going to have Congress doing what Congress should do. We're going to have the debates. But here's the point. There's a famous Churchill quote. I hardly do an interview without doing some sort of Churchill quote. There's a Churchill quote which I should memorize where he says that starting a war is a bit like a ship setting out to sea. You don't know what tides, waves, winds, storms you're going to encounter. And I hear people say, it's going to be 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. I mean, BS. We don't know how long this lasts because, as we say, the enemy has a vote. And so how's that relevant to this conversation? Well, if a war can go longer than you expect, and more Americans may get injured and killed than you'd expect, and we already see 4 Americans killed. And someone who graduated from West Point, taught at West Point, and had friends not return from war, that hits me in a way that it hits other people who've served in the U.S. military, and I'm sure Israelis feel the same way about IDF casualties, of course. Then that's why you need to tell the Americans about what we're doing, what the objectives are, why this is worthy of sacrifice, and try to build consensus. And so I think the administration made a mistake and showed, if I'm being blunt, a little bit of disrespect for the Article 1 branch of government here. And the longer this war goes and the more casualties we see, the more I think that mistake will cost them.
And the option of, I heard Hegseth, he did relate to the issue of the, boots on the ground, forever war. It seems that they're not going in that direction. And, he was very clear, as was the president, by the way, that we're not going in that. This is not going to happen. However long it takes, weeks, days, if longer, but this is not going to be repeat of Iraq '03 or Afghanistan.
Right. One of the things I said is that this is not going to be the 12-day war, both in terms of what was the American involvement in the 12-day war after the Israelis did a lot of the hard work for about 11 days, flying American fighter jets, launching in many cases American munitions, improved by incredibly skilled, brave Israelis who tricked out their F-35s and F-15s to make them even more awesome, making the job easier for when the Americans arrived. We did one really impressive mission that the Israelis could not do. So let's not oversell or undersell what the United States did. But that was one mission, and there was a clear off-ramp. I don't know what the off-ramp looks like here. See previous comments about bringing the importance of Congress along. The administration is suggesting that this is not going to go on indefinitely. They're basically shadow boxing with the ghosts of 20 years in Iraq. You heard Secretary Hegseth talk about 200,000 troops in Iraq. I believe the high water mark for U.S. troops in Iraq was 170,000. High water mark in Afghanistan was 100,000. No American that I know of wants that. And so what are we talking about? We're talking about what we are in now is a war, call it whatever you want, a war with Iran of uncertain duration that will take the lives of some Americans, that will expend to some degree finite munitions that we need in other theaters around the world, and for which we have not been producing nearly enough for years, something that has been a real focus for me in our Center on Military and Political Power. And this administration is saying, hey, this is important. Iran is a real threat. I agree. Totally agree. We can debate the imminent thing. And they're also saying, don't worry, Americans, we're not going to get in an endless ground war. They're not using that term ground war, but that's really what they're saying.
Right.
And yet, you heard the question in the Pentagon press briefing this morning, are there any ground troops in Iran? So, I'm already hearing talk about, if there's loose nuclear material, this or that. To me, significant numbers of ground troops are ground troops. Any ground troops in Iran, by and large, would be a huge, huge mistake for the United States. And so I think just like after Vietnam, it took us Americans decades to kind of get over that. And the first Gulf War helped kind of get over the Vietnam syndrome, as some people called it. We now have I'd say a Middle East syndrome. And a lot of Americans are just kind of want to be done with the Middle East. But unfortunately, the Middle East keeps grabbing us.
Right. But can you achieve the goal that the president outlined in his initial address on Saturday, which is weaken the regime, give the people of Iran this historic generational opportunity, a moment that will pass if not seized, for them to go in, topple the government, this repressive, violent regime, seize the reins of power, and steer Iran in a different direction. We're talking by air alone, right? Is that possible?
I am skeptical, if I'm being polite Washington, D.C. language. We can absolutely severely degrade Iran's ballistic missile program, depending on how long we want to go at it. We can severely degrade their production capacity. We can sink every major Iranian naval vessel. I'm keeping a close eye on their fast attack craft. I'm glad we have A-10s there. A lot of people don't know A-10s are quite good at taking out those fast attack craft. We can weaken, we'll see what degree this extends to the terror proxies. But if we're saying regime change from the air, tell me the historical analogy for that. People have mentioned Libya. Iran is not Libya. Iran is not Libya. There are institutions, there's deep institutions in Iran that did not exist in Libya.
But also, the problem I have with Libya, correct me if I'm wrong, it didn't end so well.
Right. So Iraq didn't end well. Afghanistan didn't end well. Libya didn't end well. Each one of those deserves like 3 hours. But in the end, like Afghanistan, right, it didn't end well because America lost interest and withdrew, despite the warnings of some of us, including myself. But for this, the theory, there's a term, theory of the case. What's the theory of the case, right? Hey, we're gonna weaken the military, the intelligence, the domestic oppression apparatus, and then you Iranian people take it from here. Here's the problem with that. Whether Khamenei and a lot of his top leaders are dead. The Israelis put out a big thing of all the people that have been killed. I'm not going to shed a tear over any one of them, to put it politely. I'm not going to celebrate death, but I'm not going to shed any tears. That's great. But we still have thousands of IRGC thugs with guns and harboring a sick ideology that will murder as many Iranians as possible to retain their grip on power and their positions of privilege and power. And the Iranian people, while incredibly impressive and educated, are not armed to the teeth to confront these people. So tell me what that looks like. And by the way, we don't have to guess what they're willing to do. Just look at what they've done since December. Tens of thousands murdered. Do we really believe that all these IRGC folks were just faking it and taking orders from Khamenei, that there's no sick, true believer ideology here? So I'm deeply concerned that that we're saying, hey, Iranians rise up, but we have not sufficiently done the max support campaign that FDD and others have been calling for. Max pressure, FDD's led on that. We've also been leading on max support. And that's more important now. If the whole strategy to some degree depends on the Iranian people stepping up and taking their government, as the president said, then, do they have the means to do that? And how will the IRGC respond? And I just told you how I fear they'll respond. I am not calling for American ground troops, but I am saying we should be giving the Iranian people the means to communicate and to organize and help them, but they need to be the actors, and we should not have American ground troops on the ground.
And I think it's a super important point, because I think a lot of people don't fully understand that if you want the people to go out, again, in those big numbers, people have lost loved ones, have lost family members, have been wounded themselves, and take to the streets again, they need to know that not only do they have support, now they know that America and Israel at least are standing with them, but they have funding and they have weapons, and there's dissidents and opposition groups, and people are pushing and they're motivating and they're fighting. I want to hope and believe and pray that somebody in some intelligence agency has been doing a lot of work on this in the last few years, waiting for this day to come, talking to the Iranian army figures who, non-IRGC, who could potentially lead a coup. I mean, who knows, right? But we don't know if that's the case. And I see that you're a bit skeptical.
I am. I think, I've been doing, as you know, a 20-month or so research project on the axis of aggressors, how China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are cooperating, what the implications are of that, and how the United States and our allies and partners should respond. Lord willing, we'll have a book coming out in the next few months on that. And I mention in this context because if we could if the Iranian people could finally have a government that it's interested in their well-being rather than the export of terrorism, that would be such a win for the United States, such a win for the region, such a win for our allies and partners in the region. It would be such a good thing. But, I'm not going to be someone who sits in the safety of Washington, D.C. and just callously says, hey, Iranians, go for it. These are good people who want to be free. And this regime, this brutal, despotic, dare I say evil, can you say that in the 21st century? Evil regime has murdered them by the thousands because they simply want to be free. And so I think it's a little bit irresponsible, to use a polite word, to say, hey, stand up and take your government back, when we know how sick the ideology is of the IRGC and what they're willing to do. And so if we're going to say that, and that's in our interest for them to do that, then help them, but help them in a smart way that avoids the mistakes of the Iraq War, for example.
Okay, I want to shift gears for a moment, because something when you and I met at APEC, you enlightened me a lot about missile interceptor defense systems stockpiles. And one of the figures that you spoke a lot about, which I found to be fascinating and definitely not enough people are aware of, is that during the 12-day war, America used up about a quarter of THAAD interceptors that it had ever manufactured. So if it had about 500 or so, it used 150. Now we're talking worldwide reserves. We're looking at this war now. What's the situation of interceptors? How do you assess it? You're seeing a lot of missile defense. This is not just missiles against Israel. The United Arab Emirates put out a fact sheet just the other day where they were speaking already close to 200 ballistic missiles that have been fired their way, hundreds, close to 500 drones. Those numbers are constantly increasing. Bahrain is dealing with it. The Kuwaitis are dealing with it. They accidentally shot down a U.S. fighter jet. I mean, there's a ton of missiles that are flying through the sky. There's a lot of missile defense interceptors. Do we have enough?
No. The answer is no. So in August of 2025, me and my colleague at our Center on Military and Political Power, Ryan Brobes, published a piece in Defense News. I get some things wrong, but you'll forgive me a little pat on the back here. The title of the piece in August of 2025 was "The Urgent Need to Procure More THAAD Interceptors." So what for the listeners who don't do this stuff full time, what is a THAAD? It's the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System. This is think of it as the American version of Arrow. Okay, it's the top tier of our American layer of defense. Some Israelis will know that we've had THAAD deployed in Israel. So next time you hear someone say Israel defends itself by itself, not quite. Amazing capability, good instinct, understand the desire to say it, but not quite. So the THAAD is there, during the 12-day war, roughly speaking, this well. A lot of your listeners will as well. Iran fired roughly 500 ballistic missiles. Let's review the history real quick. April 24, 120 Iranian ballistic missiles, right? October 2024. 200 ballistic missiles, 12-day war, more than 500 ballistic missiles, and now in this war, we've passed that 500 mark in the first 2 or 3 days. So are we seeing the theme here, folks? They're trying to overwhelm American Israeli air defenses. So how many THAAD interceptors did we fire during the 12-day war? Roughly 150, roughly. Okay, these aren't, it's unclassified, 150. Okay, so you say, okay, well, how many do we have? Well, according to unclassified open source congressional documents, the Department of Defense had previously committed funding for 646. I'm a poli-sci guy, so I'm careful with my math, but 150, 646. We expended roughly a quarter of our THAAD interceptors during the 12-day, a quarter, dealing with Iran. So I just kind of was respectfully critical of some of the talking points I hear out of Israel. Let me be critical of some of the American talking points. I hear American bravado about China and the first island chain. If we expended a quarter of our THAAD interceptors dealing with Iran, how the heck do we think we're going to do in dealing with China in the worst war of the 21st century in the first island chain? And so you say, well, oh my gosh, what about this amazing American defense industrial base? How did we get to this point? I'll tell you how we got to this point. In the fiscal year 2026, not the 2016, the fiscal year 2026 Pentagon budget request, plus the reconciliation request, the Pentagon asked for a total of 37 THAAD interceptors. You heard that right. We fired over 150 in the 12-day war. And just a few months before that, the Pentagon only asked for 37. Since then, to be fair, they're like, holy cow, we need a lot more. There's been efforts, millions of dollars been dedicated to build out our production capacity, build our inventory. But that's how you get to this point. And working almost 9 years in the U.S. Senate, including 6 years for Senator Kelly Ayotte, who was on the Armed Services Committee, I saw how this works. The way it works is we spend insufficient amounts on defense, and then the Pentagon says, holy cow, that's not enough. Sorry, Bernie Sanders, you're wrong. We're spending not enough on defense. I can give you numbers on that. And so what do we cut? Some of the first things that get cut are quantities of things we purchase. We don't want to kill it completely because we want to keep the assembly lines open, but we go to what's called in Beltway land or Pentagon land, the minimum sustainment rate, just to keep the line open. But the problem with that just-in-time Walmart model, which is kind of insane for national security, is that when the crisis hits, what happens? Two things happen. You don't have enough of the interceptors in your arsenal, and you have things like this where we're spending a quarter of them just dealing with Iran, and you don't have the slack production capacity that allows you to quickly expand it. And what's particularly troubling about this is that we did our research, and the full rate when the Pentagon asked in fiscal year 2026 in reconciliation for a paltry 37, do you know what the industry was ready to produce? And I don't take a cent from the company, so this is not me shilling for some interceptor. The company could make 96. So they asked for roughly a third of what the company could produce, and they had a surge capacity to go up to 144. So do you see the problem here? The core problem is, yes, insufficient production capacity in the American industrial base, but in some cases, we're not even maximizing for key munitions and interceptors what current production capacity is. And so
is this, what we're seeing now on the battlefield, so I think is important to say, and you did mention this, but I want to stress this once again. Israelis are protected by our own missile defense systems, right? We have Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow 2, Arrow 3, but we are supported dramatically by THAAD, and which is very helpful. That's just here in Israel. You have Patriot missiles in a lot of the Gulf states. You have THAAD is it deployed in other arenas as well?
The Emiratis have THAAD. The Saudis are buying a huge quantity of THAAD that may actually, if once filled, it'd be more than the U.S. Army had as of a year or two ago. That's extraordinary. We could talk more about that and how that's actually been helpful. But, in terms of the war since October 7, the direct conflicts between Israel and Iran, let's just be clear, it's the THAAD, which was requested. Why? Because Israel didn't have sufficient air defense capacity. So, let's be clear. Israel is one of the most impressive countries in the world in terms of technological capability in air and defense, and we Americans learn a ton from them, but you do not have enough. And if you did have enough, you wouldn't have American soldiers in Israel with THAADs, and Israel would not have had to vacate your Nevatim air base because you had to prioritize other things and move all the aircraft and most of the personnel aircraft out of there, and have more than 30 Iranian missiles.
Sorry to interrupt, but when you say prioritize, what you're saying is we don't have enough missiles, interceptors, and batteries to protect everything. So we have to say, okay, this we're willing to set aside, and we're going to focus our defenses somewhere else.
Yes, I'm not saying it's evil or reckless. I would have, if I were in the shoes of Israelis, I probably, you got Jerusalem, you got Tel Aviv, you got population centers, you got Dimona, you got the Kiryat, you got your other things you got to protect. But let's be clear, and this is, I'm not revealing some deep secret here. Israel took all your aircraft out of Nevatim Air Base and moved most of your personnel out of there because you didn't have enough air defense capacity to defend it. And then the base took more than 30 Iranian ballistic missiles, including one that hit smack dab in the middle of the longest runway there, and another that hit and did serious damage to a facility that was built with U.S. foreign military financing to store your F-35 aircraft. So what I'm saying is America's not the only one that has insufficient air defense capacity, and this is something we got to be working together on.
What do we need to do? Because, the way I'm looking at this is critical. Not only, first of all, it's protecting me. I go down to my bomb shelter, and I'm hearing the booms up in the sky. I know that somebody's firing a missile that's protecting me and my kids, right? So I don't know if it's an Arrow. I don't know if it's a THAAD. I don't know which one it is in the moment. But whichever one, we have to be thankful. I see what's going on in the UAE. I see what's going on in Saudi. I see what's going on in other countries. The missile defense systems are critical, right? Dubai Airport, it's been hit a couple times. It would have been hit hundreds of times if they didn't have American missile defense systems in territory. What do we, missile defense has long been part of our architecture and has long been part of our doctrine. But clearly, with an enemy like Iran, we need a lot more of this, or is there some other change that we need to see? What would you recommend to the decision makers right now?
Yeah, no, I would recommend things that, as far as I can tell, are already underway. But just what I'm trying to do is build broader, popular knowledge about the urgency here and the capacity, the depth of the challenge here. So Israel and the United States both need significantly more production capacity for air and missile defense systems, much, much larger arsenals, and we need to be working together much more than we currently are. For example, I've long argued that we need full redundant production capacity of Arrow in the United States, not just 50% of the supplies and supply network. Everyone touts that. That's great. That's not enough. Full production capacity, redundant production capacity of Arrow in the United States. Why? One, because we need more. You Israel, need more production capacity. Obviously, I just made the case. I think that what I just said is irrefutable, respectfully. Two, we've learned that in wars, things get hit and blown up. So it's not inconceivable on Israel's worst day that things would be getting blown up, including some of your air defense production factories, too.
Right.
3, we learned that during wars, people actually, reservists get called up. And many of those reservists work in, wait for it, production facilities. And so at the very moment when you need to be expediting or increasing your production because you're in a war, a whole lot of people are leaving those factories to go fight the war in Israel. That, up to this point, that's not a problem that generally speaking Americans had. And so for those 3 reasons, those are 3 just solely from an Israeli perspective why you would want to have this. Now, some people hearing this say, well, wait, Brad, America has proven itself a little bit unreliable. Yes. But so far, the distinction is, which I don't like at all, and we could discuss, is the offense-defense distinction. So I believe that will be the last thing that the United States will deprive of Israel, air and missile defenses, for reasons we can understand. And I believe, and I hope that on Israel's worst day, America will be at its best and will be there. And so that's just one example. But it's about demand signal. Demand signal. That's fancy language for defense spending. America over the last few years has been spending about 3% roughly of our gross domestic product on defense. Other than 3 years before 9/11, by that metric, that's the least we've spent on defense since 1940, 1 year before Pearl Harbor. So no wonder our arsenal of democracy is not what it used to be. What we've started to fix that after Putin's wake-up call on February 24, 2022. We've made great progress, but we got a long way to go. The Trump administration, with its Arsenal of Freedom effort, I like our name better, is making positive steps. Israel, a lot of Israeli companies are working 2-3 shifts. You guys are spending crazy amounts percentage of your GDP on defense. I think that's necessary because you have to replenish, modernize, and expand your arsenal. And you have to prepare for the worst case scenario because you Israelis don't know what happens on January 21st, 2029 here in the United States and how that might affect you. So you've got a 3-year window. By the way, you're depleting some of your resources now, so that's going to increase your need to replenish, make that more challenging. And you got a 3-year window where you need to be not taking 2 years to decide you want the KC-46. You need to hurry up, make decisions of anything you need from the United States and request it fast because you have a window here to get things so that you can continue to defend yourself, which I believe is obviously in the American national security interest.
And by the way, that same thinking applies to the possibility of a new MOU, Memorandum of Understanding of foreign military aid to Israel, which expires in 2028, and means if we want this, and I think we do want it, we have to get a move on it because this current president might be the last one who would be willing to do something with Israel in that sense.
I agree, and I published a piece that your listeners might be interested on December 19th. They can Google my name and type Israel Strategic Partnership Agreement. I put forward, a lot of people are talking a good game, but I said, hey, let me lay out what I think a strategic partnership agreement that would look like that would replace the current MOU. And right now the vibe in the United States is that we don't do charity, we don't give gifts. We like partners that carry their own weight. Well, in the national defense strategy, the Trump administration's national defense strategy, they only called one country in the world a model ally, and they called Israel that. So that's good. So you guys are viewed by this administration as a country that does carry your weight. You have muscles, and you're also willing to throw punches. And so that sits well with the political vibe in the United States right now. But even with that, if you're going to replace this MOU and get this administration, President Trump, to sign it, he has to have things that he can credibly say are wins for him. Right. And so I laid out 3 commitments that I believe Israelis should make that would demonstrate that this is a partnership and not a charity case, which it's never been. I don't believe that, but we got to make sure it's not characterized or misunderstood that way. So 3 commitments that Israelis make in return for a continuation of an inflation-adjusted amount of FMF, which I call a partnership investment incentive. That's not like some spin. The key difference between that and the old $3.8 billion per year that's under the current MOU would be that it would be inflation adjusted to $5 billion, and you, Israel, would have to spend all of it in the United States. Some of your listeners may know that in the current MOU, there's something called offshore procurement, where a portion of that money can be spent in the United States. I don't think that's politically doable in the United States right now, and you, Israel, don't need it because you need to spend you need to spend every cent of that in the United States. buying things that you cannot produce, like F-35s and KC-46s. So that I could talk about the other commitments, but those are some of the ideas I've laid out in that December 19 piece on what should replace the current MOU.
We will add that link to the notes of this podcast. And Bradley, I just want to really, we've gone a little over time, but this was just so fascinating, I think, definitely for me. And I hope also, I'm pretty confident for our listeners and our viewers as well. So I really want to thank you for taking out the time and joining me today.
No, I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot. Best wishes to you.
Thanks for joining me on today's episode. We will continue with our coverage of the ongoing war. We'll have more episodes for you throughout the week. In the meantime, to everyone who's listening and watching, stay safe.